I made a video a few weeks ago about Days Gone, wherein I said that, quote, Days Gone doesn't actually do anything well. I tore the game apart for its technical issues and explained how, in my mind, the game was not worth the $60 price tag in its current state. At that time, I was around 20 to 25 hours through the game. And for a title that's roughly 35 hours long, I felt as though I had a strong enough grasp on what it offered to reach a safe conclusion. In that moment, I felt as though it were like when you're at a play or a musical, and after the first act, you usually have a really good idea as to whether or not the second act will
suck! You are no talent!
Not all the time, but let's be honest, most of the time this is the case. If, after an hour of sitting through the show, there are butts and nipples protruding about, chances are that the second act won't be any different. Not that this specific example is a bad thing. Cabaret is actually a really good show, if you want to check it out. But the point stands, in almost every piece of entertainment, the tone and tenor of what the piece will be will have been set in place and motion by the time that you're halfway through it. As for Days Gone, I felt as though after playing through the first half, surely the game would have shown me the majority of things it had to offer. After all, usually games will give you all of the tools you'll need in the first half and then spend the second half playing around with those mechanics. Whether you look at The Witcher 3, Red Dead Redemption 2, God of War, or even Lego Star Wars, this is always the case. It was an assumption, I grant you, but I felt as though it were one justified. Much to my surprise, however, Days Gone feels like a totally different game in the last half compared to the first. It changes completely, and I went from being insulted by its mediocrity to being amazed at its potential. Basically, the game is boring and bland until it isn't. If that sounds excessively vague, don't worry, I'll explain. Point being, I made an assumption, and I made a video based off of that assumption, and for that I'm sorry. I learned my lesson, and I won't be doing that again. But I guess I should explain why I was wrong. Days Gone does actually do some things quite well. In that video a few weeks ago, I criticized its excessive technical issues, something I still stand by, but I also said that the weapon variety was abysmal and the characters were uninteresting. Now that I've completed 2 full runs of the game in preparation for my critique, I can say that I was sort of wrong on these points. Sort of, because they were true to me at the time, but by the end of the game, things had changed. You see, I just finished my hour-long critique of the game, wherein I deep dive into all of this. Patrons and channel members can see it right now, and it'll go public in a few days for everybody else. But in that video, I deep dive like a madman into everything that the game does and has to offer. And so to avoid repeating myself, I'll keep it brief, and if you want to hear my complete thoughts and let me know yours, I encourage you to check out the critique. Regardless, Days Gone is the most perfect example of a diamond in the rough that I've seen in the gaming industry in a long while. Now, it doesn't mean that it's a gem of a game in a sea of bad games, but rather that there's a gem of a game deep down in the thick that is Days Gone's presentation. The core game is a blast, and the performances that the actors give are, for the most part, great, with only a couple that fall very, very flat. I'm looking at you, Tucker. The problem is that the game has a ton of trouble framing itself properly and presenting its best parts to the player. In fact, all of the issues I have with the game tie back into the directors and the management over at Sony Bend Studios. For instance, I think that the game was twice as long as it needed to be, and because they weren't able to properly manage their scope, the game's overall quality suffered significantly. And this, of course, falls on the directors who are in charge of managing quality and making sure that the team hasn't bitten off more than they can chew. And this is the weird thing about Days Gone. Most of my criticisms that I made in that initial video still stand true, for me at least. The difference is that the last 10 or so hours of the game were so good that I changed my mind and now think that the rough first 20 hours or so are worth trudging through to reach its good parts in the last 20 or so hours. Again, you have to sort through the rough to get the diamond. This is part of the reason that I feel the game could be half the length and end up being better for it. There's so much fluff in the opening hours that obscures the best parts of Days Gone. It feels as though the developers are shooting themselves in the foot constantly. For example, players will, of course, want to take on hordes and swarms immediately. I know I did. The problem is that you only have low-level gear, such as sawed-off shotguns and a crossbow through the first 10 hours. Then you get some rifles and things become easier, but you still don't have anywhere near the gear necessary to take on the sawmill horde, for instance. The best part of Days Gone is the horde mechanic, at least in my opinion, and it seems as though Sony Bend Studios actually agrees with this, which is why it was the first big thing they showed off back at E3. But despite this being their ace in the hole, they keep the card close to their chest until you're around 25 hours in, when they give you the tools necessary to take on the hordes and have it remain fun. Now sure, you can take on hordes at lower difficulty levels. I tried multiple times, but this usually entails somewhat spammy techniques, such as running in, pulling a couple dozen off of the horde, picking them off one by one, and then repeating the process until the horde is gone. This can be fun, but it is no doubt different from the chaotic brawl that erupts when you take on a horde in the late game with proper tools. This is when the game is at its best, in my opinion. Nothing feels quite as great as overcoming impossible odds and taking down hundreds or even thousands of freakers by yourself. But for some reason, Days Gone keeps these away from you until the end chapters of the game. I honestly don't know why. I get wanting to keep your best cards close to your chest, as I said, but you need to play them before you've lost. Otherwise, they're not actually worth anything. I've gotten tweets from at least a dozen people who all told me that they gave up on the game after around 10 to 15 hours because they felt as though they had been lied to about the horde mechanic. They were seriously convinced that taking on the massive hordes like the one at the sawmill that was shown at E3 wasn't actually in the final game because they hadn't seen anything like it even after 15 hours. Now, whether or not holding these tools from the player is a good idea for sake of pace can certainly be argued, but what can't be argued is that if you're losing players' interest because you're taking too long to provide them what they feel they paid for, you are messing up big time. Now, I could talk about this for an hour. In fact, I did. That's what the critique is for. So I'll leave it at this. Days Gone is a blast, but it fails to pace itself properly and as a result makes an awful first impression. It really is too bad because if the game were able to put its best foot forward, I honestly believe that it would have gotten an average score in the high 80s as opposed to the high 60s. But let me know your thoughts below. Again, I'm sorry for jumping on the hate bandwagon so quickly with that other video, and I can promise you that I'll be much more critical of these games and myself moving forward. But that's all from me. Thank you for watching so much. It really does mean the world to me. Like I said, the full hour-long critique of the game will launch in a few days for everybody, so if you'd like to see it, make sure that you subscribe and hit the notification bell. But with all that being said, I love you all, and I'll see you in the next video.